The engine coughed once, twice, then quit entirely, and Marcus gripped the steering wheel of the sleek black car, with knuckles going white as he glanced in the rearview mirror at his employer Sterling Cross, who was scrolling furiously through emails on his tablet, completely oblivious that they had stopped moving in the middle of East Baltimore, which was terrible, genuinely terrible, because in exactly 40 minutes Sterling was supposed to be at the ribbon cutting of Cross Culinary's newest venture, Solstice, where he'd be expected to do what he'd been avoiding for 9 months. And so Marcus said carefully, using that particular tone he reserved for delivering unwelcome news to a man who considered incompetence a personal insult. "I'm terribly sorry, sir, but something appears wrong with the engine." And Sterling's fingers froze above his tablet screen as his jaw tightened in that specific way that made seasoned executives instinctively straighten their ties before he slowly and deliberately looked up and said, "We're stopped," which wasn't a question but an observation delivered with the kind of surgical calm that suggested someone's employment was hanging by a thread, and Marcus confirmed, "Yes, sir. In the middle of traffic. Yes, sir. In a vehicle you specifically requested I service before your return from Amsterdam." And Marcus's formal accent thickened slightly under pressure as he began explaining, "To be fair, sir, you returned nearly 4 weeks ahead of schedule, and this particular car has been in storage for 7 months while you were." Before Sterling simply said, "Marcus, stop explaining and fix it," and stared out the tinted window with barely contained frustration, counting 38 minutes now until he had to stand before Baltimore's culinary elite and financial backers and restaurant critics and manufacture another excuse for why Sterling Cross, proprietor of 8 upscale dining establishments, couldn't actually eat at his own restaurants, because 9 months of this exhausting charade had worn him down completely. 9 months surviving on the most tasteless food he could prepare himself. 9 months of fabricated dietary restrictions and narrowly avoided disasters, and the perpetual dread that someone would uncover his secret and demolish everything he'd constructed from nothing. And he looked out the window again, exhaling a slow, frustrated breath, and that's when he noticed her, a young woman wearing a vibrant orange apron, reading May's comfort bowls in faded blue lettering, standing approximately 12 feet away beside a food cart that had weathered considerable years, studying his car with an expression that suggested she'd just discovered buried treasure wrapped in imported steel, her eyes bright and calculating in a way Sterling recognized immediately as identical to the expression people wore when they noticed exactly how expensive his watch was. So he watched with mild irritation as Marcus climbed out to examine the hood and then, after several minutes, decided to step outside himself. While across the street, Camille, May could hardly believe what she was witnessing, because her luck had been consistently catastrophic for the past 5 months, ever since her mother Dorothea had suffered her heart attack, and Camille had taken over her beloved noodle cart, ever since regular customers began walking past like she'd become invisible, because she wasn't the legendary Dorothea May, ever since hospital. Invoices started accumulating faster than her fading hope of settling them, but this gorgeous and obviously astronomical luxury car stalling directly in front of her cart on a Wednesday afternoon when she'd earned only $42 felt like divine intervention. So she whispered into her phone, "Priya, I need you witnessing this immediately." And her closest friend's voice crackled through saying, "Girl, I'm literally in surgery prep." Before Camille interrupted, "There is a luxury car broken down directly in front of my cart." And Priya said, "Cam, you cannot ambush wealthy strangers." But Camille grinned and said, "Watch me," and hung up before rationality could win the argument, because rationality wasn't going to address the $4,000 cardiac rehabilitation bill due next Friday. And then the rear door of the luxury car opened, and Camille forgot how breathing functioned, because the man who emerged was tall, not ordinary tall, but professional athlete tall, at minimum 6 foot, for with shoulders broad enough to obstruct natural light, completely bald and smooth and polished and immaculate, his deep brown complexion looking like something carved from rich mahogany, wearing a slate-gray suit that had definitely cost more than her monthly rent, and when he removed his sunglasses, she encountered the most penetrating dark eyes she'd witnessed in her entire life, and he also looked annoyed enough to rearrange someone's universe, but even radiating irritation when his expression shifted momentarily. Camille caught a glimpse of dimples that made her stomach perform acrobatics, and she murmured to herself, "Oh, he is absolutely furious. That is the somebody's professional future is ending expression." And she heard the driver whose nameplate read Marcus speaking urgently, saying, "Sir, I'll contact a mechanic and arrange an alternative vehicle immediately. You'll still arrive at Solstice on time, I guarantee it." And the man responded in a voice deep and carrying natural authority, "You have 38 minutes to fulfill that guarantee." And Camille's eyes widened as recognition finally crystallized, because Solstice was the prestigious new restaurant opening in the Harbor District belonging to some billionaire restaurateur, and this was Sterling Cross, owner of Cross Culinary, the dominant restaurant group across the Mid-Atlantic region. The man she'd seen in business magazines at her dentist's office, described as Baltimore's most influential entrepreneur and the man with the refined palate, and he was standing 11 feet from her cart, looking like he was mentally composing termination letters. So Camille quickly checked her reflection in the cart's polished surface, confirmed her braids were still presentable, assembled her most professional smile, and approached him saying, "Excuse me," and Sterling turned toward the sound and found her. Advancing with confident strides and up close, she was genuinely striking, with warm sienna skin and honey amber eyes sparkling with something positioned between mischief and genuine urgency, and he asked in the tone that typically prompted people to reconsider their life choices, "Can I assist you?" And she said, "Actually, I believe I can assist you. I couldn't help but observe your vehicular situation, and I thought that man is probably stressed, probably hungry, probably needs something genuinely delicious to salvage his afternoon." And Sterling stared at her and said, "I'm fine." And she said, "Are you certain? Because your driver appears on the verge of emotional collapse, and you have that particular vein near your temple, suggesting you're approximately 2 additional inconveniences from a medical event," which caused Marcus to produce a strangled sound and Sterling's eye to develop a slight twitch before he said, "Miss." And she said, Camille May, and this is May's Comfort Bowls, home of the finest noodle bowls in East Baltimore. My mother built this cart 23 years ago, and people travel specifically for her recipes." And Sterling said, "That's admirable, I'm not interested." And she said, "You haven't reviewed the menu yet." And he said, "I don't require a menu." And she launched into her offerings anyway, saying, "We have the May Original with rice noodles and spiced shrimp and roasted peppers and caramelized onions, and a broth that genuinely addresses whatever's troubling you. There's the Garden Abundance for the health conscious, and the Fire Walker for people who appreciate intensity," before Sterling interrupted, saying, "Miss May, I appreciate the entrepreneurial spirit, however, I don't consume street food." And the irony wasn't lost on him. Sterling Cross, who could eat nothing except his own deliberately bland cooking, declining food from a cart, and Camille's smile held, but something flickered briefly in her eyes. Perhaps hurt, or perhaps something more combustible, before she said, "That's perfectly fine. Most people driving vehicles like yours typically don't," and turned to leave, and Sterling should have allowed it, should have returned to the car and found a way to reach Solstice and manufactured another excuse. But then she muttered under her breath, "Even though they're completely missing out on the finest meal of their entirely too expensive lives," and Sterling's eyebrow elevated as he said, "Excuse me," and Camille spun around, having apparently abandoned diplomatic restraint entirely, and said, "Look, sir, Mr. Cross, I completely understand. You're wealthy and significant, and you control half the restaurant landscape in this region, and you have destinations and appointments, but your car is genuinely not moving anytime soon, and I'm simply trying to sustain a business. So here's my proposal. 1 complimentary sample, miniature portion. If you find it unsatisfactory, I disappear permanently. If you find it worthwhile, you contribute whatever you consider fair. Agreement. And Sterling said no. And she said, why not? And he said, because I said no. And she said, that isn't actually reasoning, that's avoidance. And he said, it's the only reasoning you'll receive. And Camille placed both hands on her hips, and Sterling noticed. They were trembling almost imperceptibly, because this wasn't routine sales strategy. This woman was genuinely desperate. And then she said very quietly, with all the playfulness gone completely, please, simply 1 taste. That's my entire request. And Sterling looked at her. Really genuinely looked at her. The worn apron showing years of dedicated use. The cart needing fresh paint. The hope and fear conducting simultaneous warfare in her amber eyes. And something made him pause. Maybe recognizing desperation because he'd inhabited it himself for 9 months. Maybe watching someone fight for something despite overwhelming odds. And that small, impossible voice whispered, what if this particular time is different? And it wouldn't be, it never was. But Marcus was on the phone with the mechanic saying minimum 35 minutes, and Sterling had time available, and this woman was looking at him like he held her entire world in his hands. So he heard himself say, fine, 1 bite, and Camille's entire face illuminated like she'd won something extraordinary as she said, truly won. And he repeated firmly, 1 bite, then you leave me in peace. And she said, absolute agreement, and practically sprinted back to her cart, moving with the efficient, practiced grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime cooking. And Marcus materialized at Sterling's elbow saying, sir, are you entirely certain that's advisable given your current condition? And Sterling said, it's 1 bite, Marcus. And 4 minutes later Camille returned with a small bowl that produced an aroma Sterling's body hadn't properly processed in nearly a year, and his stomach, which had been thoroughly conditioned to reject anything he hadn't personally prepared, actually growled audibly. And Camille announced, May original, sample portion. The broth is my mother's private formula for generations of accumulated flavor right there in that bowl. And Sterling accepted it, the ceramic warm against his palms, and lifted the fork to his lips while Camille held her breath. So completely, she seemed to stop existing for a moment, and Sterling thought, here it comes. The nausea, the rejection, the same humiliation as every previous attempt. And he took a bite, and nothing happened. No nausea, no constriction in his throat, no immediate desperate urge to expel it. And he chewed slowly, deliberately waiting for the inevitable revulsion that didn't arrive, and instead he tasted something warm and complex, spice and depth and something almost floral in the broth, the noodles perfectly silky, the shrimp tender, and seasoned precisely right, and it was impossibly genuinely delicious, and his body was accepting every bit of it, and his hand trembled slightly as he took another bite, then another after that, thinking what in the world was happening. And Camille's voice came softly, you actually like it? And Sterling couldn't find words, and simply continued eating bite after measured bite until the sample bowl was entirely empty, because 9 months of flavorless rice and completely unseasoned proteins, 9 months of cooking tasteless meals, because anything else produced immediate physical rejection, 9 months of watching his weight decline, and his confidence erode, and his hope diminish to almost nothing. And this woman with the braids and the worn orange apron had just fed him like it required no effort whatsoever. And Camille stared at the empty vessel and said, you ate everything. And Sterling looked down at it like it had materialized through some unexplainable process, and asked, his voice rougher than intended, who taught you to cook? And she said with unmistakable pride, my mother, Dorothea May. She's been preparing soul food since before I existed. Everything I know traces directly back to her. And he asked, where is she currently? and something painful moved across her expression as she said, "Cardiac rehabilitation. She had a heart attack 5 months ago. I've been maintaining the cart throughout her recovery." And Sterling nodded slowly, his mind processing at considerable speed, because this was medically implausible and psychologically impossible, since he'd consulted 4 therapists and 2 psychiatrists and a cognitive behavioral specialist and someone who practiced alternative approaches, and nothing had produced results until this woman's cooking. And Marcus called out, "Sir, the backup vehicle has arrived," sounding genuinely astonished that Sterling had consumed anything at all, and Sterling knew he should leave and thank her and never look back. But he couldn't, because for the first time in 9 months he'd eaten food prepared by someone else, and his body had simply accepted it. So he withdrew his wallet and extracted 6 crisp $100 bills, and Camille's eyes expanded to considerable dimensions as she said, "Sir, that was a complimentary sample, as in genuinely free of charge." And he said, "I'm aware of what complimentary means. Consider this appropriate compensation for your skill and your time." And she said, "That's $600. And he said, "I'm capable of counting." And she said, "For a sample bowl that cost perhaps $4 in materials." And he said, "Miss May, do you want the money or not?" And Camille secured those bills with a speed that suggested excellent reflexes, saying, "I want the money. I absolutely want the money. Thank you tremendously, Mr. Cross." And Sterling's lips moved in something approaching a smile as he said, "I'll return tomorrow, same time, have another bowl prepared," and then turned and walked toward the waiting SUV, leaving Camille standing on the sidewalk with $600 and an expression of profound confusion. And the pattern persisted for 8 days, straight with Sterling's SUV parking at her cart every afternoon, and him ordering 2 bowls and paying $600 and disappearing behind tinted windows. And by the 8th day, Camille had accumulated $4,800 and significantly reduced her mother's medical debt and become something of a local phenomenon. And on day 9, Sterling broke the pattern by emerging from the SUV and approaching the cart, and when Camille reached for her ingredients, he raised one hand and said, "Not today. Miss, may I have a proposition to discuss?" And she asked, "What category of proposition?" And he said, "I'd like to hire you as my personal chef. You'd prepare my meals exclusively. I'll compensate you at $18,000 weekly." And the street tilted beneath her feet as she calculated 18,000. That's over 70,000 monthly for cooking. And he said yes. And her mind was performing calculations at unprecedented speed, because 70,000 monthly would eliminate her mother's medical debt within weeks, and would preserve the cart's legacy, and would fundamentally transform everything. But nothing presented itself, this simply without substantial strings attached, so she asked directly, "Why? Why would someone pay that for a personal chef when you operate 8 restaurants staffed with professionally trained culinary experts? What's the actual catch?" And Sterling's jaw tightened, and for a considerable moment Camille thought he might not answer at all before he said very quietly, "Let's simply say I have particular dietary requirements that you appear uniquely positioned to address." And she said, "That is the least specific answer I've received in my entire existence." And he said, "It's the only answer I'm prepared to offer at this moment." And she crossed her arms and studied him carefully, because something significant was being withheld, something genuinely large. And she asked, "And if I decline?" And he said, "Then I'll continue purchasing 2 bowls daily, and we'll both proceed as though this conversation never occurred." And she knew she should decline, because accepting employment from an enigmatic billionaire who refused to explain his actual need for her specifically was essentially the premise of every thriller where the protagonist made one fatally curious decision. But 70,000 monthly, and her mother's rehabilitation costs, and their entire future made her say, "I can't abandon my mother's cart. This business represents her entire life's work." And Sterling said, not unkindly, simply factually, "You're barely sustaining it. Without my purchases, your daily earnings average, perhaps $60 to $80. That's not financially viable long term." And it stung precisely because it was accurate. So she proposed, "What if I work mornings for you and maintain the cart through afternoons?" And Sterling considered this briefly and said, "I eat lunch exclusively for my primary meal. Mornings are entirely workable." And she said, "And I can terminate the arrangement anytime. No complications." And he said, "Anytime." And she said, "And you'll eventually explain the genuine reason behind all of this." And Sterling's intense eyes met hers as he said, "Eventually." And Camille bit her lower lip, thinking through every angle, because this was unusual and suspicious, and potentially the worst professional decision she'd ever make, or possibly the best. And she asked, "May I have time to consider?" And Sterling said, "Take whatever time you need," and retrieved his phone and typed briefly and displayed the screen saying, "That's my direct number. Contact me when you've decided." And she stared at the digits, her heartbeat noticeably elevated. And he added, turning back toward his SUV, "I should inform you I'm not a particularly accommodating employer. I maintain specific standards, and there are complications you should understand exist." And she asked, "What variety of complications?" And he said, "The kind we'll address if you accept." And she said, "That is genuinely unsettling." And those penetrating dark eyes fixed on hers again. And this time Camille detected something in them that resembled profound loneliness as he said, "Miss May, I'm offering you compensation that exceeds what most professionals earn annually, and I won't pretend it arrives without conditions attached. But I promise you, I will never ask you to do anything that compromises your integrity or your safety. This arrangement is fundamentally about food, nothing beyond that." And Camille believed him, which was either her instincts operating correctly or her financial circumstances doing the reasoning. And that night she stared at his number in her phone until finally at 11:52 p.m. she typed, "Mr. Cross, this is Camille May. I've considered your offer, and I have conditions. 1, mornings only. 2, I maintain the cart through afternoons on my schedule. 3, I can terminate at any time without explanation required. For you eventually tell me the genuine reason behind this arrangement. If these terms are acceptable, I accept." And pressed send before her nerve abandoned her entirely, and her phone responded 40 seconds later with "Agreed. Report to this address tomorrow at 8 a.m. Dress comfortably. We need to discuss the full parameters of your role and the confidentiality it requires. SC," followed by a Harbor District address. And Camille whispered, "Confidentiality. Oh goodness, what exactly am I walking into?" And the following morning, she stood outside his building feeling acutely conscious of wearing jeans and a May's Comfort Bowls t-shirt, while the doorman verified her identity and directed her to the penthouse, where Marcus was waiting saying, "Miss May, precisely punctual. Mr. Cross is in his study. Please follow me." Through a penthouse that was expansive and slightly intimidating, with floor-to-ceiling windows, commanding harbor views and furniture suggesting careful curation, and a quietness that transformed it into something closer to a gallery than a home. And Sterling looked up from his mahogany desk when she entered, and Camille was struck again by how remarkably handsome he was when not actively broadcasting executive irritation. And he stood and indicated the chair across from his desk, saying, "Miss May, thank you for coming. We have significant things to address before you begin." And after she sat, he closed his laptop and leaned forward, his dark eyes holding hers with complete steadiness, and said, "What I'm about to share remains entirely between us. No one, not your mother, not your friends, not anyone in your life, can have this information. I need your commitment before I continue." And she said, "You have it." And Sterling appeared to gather himself for something requiring considerable effort before saying, 9 months ago something happened that altered everything about how I function professionally and personally. I developed a condition, psychological with physical manifestations, and the medical community hasn't reached consensus on exactly how to categorize it. Where I cannot consume food prepared by other people, the moment I attempt to, my body produces immediate rejection, acute nausea, occasionally worse. It's severe enough that I've been unable to eat at my own restaurants or attend industry dinners or operate normally within an industry constructed entirely around shared food experiences. And Camille breathed, "Oh my God," and Sterling continued, "I own Cross Culinary, 8 high-end establishments. My professional identity is built on possessing the most discerning palate in the Mid-Atlantic region. I'm expected to personally approve every menu and evaluate every signature preparation and guarantee quality standards across all locations. And if this becomes public knowledge," and Camille finished quietly, "it destroys you." And Sterling said, "It destroys everything I've constructed over 15 years. Who trusts a restaurant owner who cannot eat his own food? Investors exit, competitors circle, customers lose confidence. Everything collapses under the weight of one revealed truth." And Camille said, "But you ate my food." And Sterling said, with something raw moving briefly across his features, "You're the first person whose cooking I've been able to consume since this began. The only person across 9 months. I've pursued every conventional and unconventional treatment available, and nothing produced results until you." And she asked, "Why me?" And he said, "I genuinely don't know. But Camille, you're not simply providing cooking services. You're preserving my ability to function, my career, everything I've spent my life constructing." And the weight of that statement settled around her like something tangible as she said slowly, "That's why the 18,000 weekly, that's why the confidentiality requirements. You're trusting me with something that could end you." And he said, "You're the only barrier currently standing between me and complete professional destruction." And Camille sat back and let herself process everything properly, because Sterling Cross wasn't merely a wealthy man who appreciated her cooking. He was desperate and vulnerable in ways that contradicted everything his public persona projected, and he was extending trust that he'd clearly been unable to extend to anyone for nearly a year. And she asked, "Does anyone else know?" And he said, "Marcus and my head of security. Those are the only 2 individuals." And she said, "Not even your girlfriend." And something unreadable moved across Sterling's expression as he said, "Especially not her." And she asked, "Why?" And he said, "Because Vivian cannot maintain confidentiality when information benefits her socially, and she doesn't need access to my vulnerabilities," which was an illuminating characterization of a relationship. And Camille said, "Practically, she's going to want to meet me. If you suddenly have a personal chef, curiosity is inevitable." And Sterling said, "I know, which is why we establish parameters now. As far as anyone outside this arrangement is concerned, you're simply my chef. Nothing about my condition enters those conversations." And she asked, "What do I say when someone asks why you need a personal chef when you have 8 restaurants full of professionals?" And he said, "Tell them I have specific nutritional requirements related to my athletic training. I train in boxing. It's entirely credible." And Camille considered this and said, "Fair enough. So let me confirm my understanding. I cook for you Monday through Friday mornings. I maintain absolute confidentiality about your condition. I interact with your girlfriend and maintain the cover story. In exchange, 18,000 weekly." And he said, "Correct." And she said, "And eventually you tell me what actually caused this condition." And Sterling's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he said, "When I'm ready." And Camille studied him carefully, this brilliant, powerful, genuinely wounded man extending his trust like it cost him something real, and said, "All right, I'm in." And relief moved through Sterling's expression like light breaking through cloud cover as he said, "Thank you." And then she said, "But Sterling, you should know something. I'm going to do more than cook for you. I'm going to make you love food again." And Sterling's dimples appeared for the first time since she'd known him, and Camille's heart performed something distinctly unprofessional as he said, "I'm counting on exactly that, Miss May." And the first 4 days working for Sterling Cross felt like inhabiting a dream Camille hadn't known she was eligible to experience, because his penthouse kitchen was a professional's paradise with restaurant-grade everything and ingredients sourced from suppliers she'd previously only read about, and the freedom to cook according to her genuine instincts. But the finest element of all was watching Sterling eat, and on her first official morning, she'd prepared her mother's recipe for catfish with stone-ground grits and a smoky tomato cream reduction, and brought it to Sterling's study, where he was mid-conversation on a video call, and he'd raised one finger, without looking up, saying, "Wait," before ending the call with efficient authority, and then looking down at the plate and going completely still. And when Camille asked nervously, "Is something incorrect?" Sterling lifted his fork with deliberate slowness, as though afraid the food might prove illusory, and took a bite and closed his eyes, and Camille watched this controlled, formidable man's entire bearing soften into something that looked like relief and gratitude combined, like someone who'd been wandering through drought conditions and finally encountered water. And when he opened his eyes, they were noticeably bright, as he said in a voice that had lost its usual crispness, "This is, thank you." And those 2 words held 9 months of suffering inside them, and Camille felt something tighten in her chest that she couldn't immediately categorize as she said softly, "You're welcome." And that became their morning rhythm, with Camille cooking and Sterling eating with the concentrated appreciation of someone who understood exactly what the ability to eat represented, and gradually, so incrementally, that Camille almost missed it happening, they began to talk, not about his condition or the arrangement, but about everything surrounding those things. And on day 3, while Sterling was eating her braised short ribs, he asked, "Why cooking? What drew you to it specifically?" And Camille shrugged, stirring a pot of simmering reduction, and said, "I didn't select it, it arrived on its own. I grew up in that cart. My mother let me stand on an overturned milk crate and stir the broth when I was 4. By 9, I was managing vegetable prep. By 14, I could operate the entire setup independently." And he asked, "Did other paths ever interest you?" And she said, "Sometimes. I received a culinary school acceptance once, full scholarship, competitive program." And Sterling looked up with immediate attention, asking, "Why didn't you go?" And she said, "Because Mama needed me. The cart was struggling through a rough period, and I couldn't leave her to manage it alone. So I stayed." And he asked, "Do you carry regret about that decision?" And she considered honestly before saying, "I used to, but now I think things arrange themselves for reasons. If I'd gone to culinary school, I wouldn't have been at that cart on the afternoon your expensive car chose to stop functioning." And Sterling's dimples surfaced briefly as he said, "Fate or genuinely poor vehicle maintenance." And he actually laughed, and the sound made Camille's stomach perform that increasingly frequent fluttery thing she was trying very hard not to analyze. And on day 6, Sterling surprised her by coming into the kitchen while she was cooking rather than waiting in his study, and asked, "What are you preparing?" leaning against the counter, looking different in casual clothing, dark slacks, and a fitted charcoal sweater that acknowledged his athletic build without advertising it. And Camille tried not to notice as she said, "Braised oxtails with butter beans and cornbread, comfort food, my grandmother's recipe." And Sterling said quietly, "My mother made oxtails," which was the first personal disclosure he'd offered that wasn't connected to business or his condition. And Camille kept her voice casual as she encouraged, "Yeah." And Sterling said, "Every Sunday, she'd start them before church and let them develop all day. The entire house would carry that particular smell." And Camille noticed the past tense, and Sterling said before she could ask, "She passed 11 years ago, pancreatic cancer. It moved quickly." And Camille said, "I'm genuinely sorry." And Sterling nodded, his gaze traveling somewhere internal as he said, "She was the one who taught me that food matters, said the way someone feeds people tells you everything about how they regard them." And Camille said, "She sounds remarkable." And Sterling said, she would have appreciated you." and the words hung in the space between them charged with something Camille didn't want to examine directly, before she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "Why?" And Sterling's dark eyes met hers as he said, "Because you cook the way she described, like the person. Receiving the food matters to you. Not just technically, though your technique is genuinely excellent, but something beyond that, something that makes every dish feel like it was prepared specifically for whoever's eating it." And Camille felt her heart conducting itself in ways that were distinctly inappropriate for a professional arrangement, and said, "Food is how we demonstrate care when language isn't sufficient." And Sterling held her gaze for a moment that stretched beyond comfortable, professional boundaries, and the air between them shifted into awareness that definitely crossed the employer-employee line before his phone rang and broke the moment cleanly, and Sterling checked the screen, and his expression rearranged itself into something resembling resignation or dread as he stepped out saying, "Vivian, yes, I understand we were supposed to. I've had significant professional obligations. Tomorrow evening fine. Understood." And Camille heard this and focused with excessive concentration on her oxtails and told herself firmly that her chest felt completely normal. And that evening Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, saying, "Miss May, Mr. Cross wanted me to let you know his companion will be visiting tomorrow afternoon around 2:30. He'd like you to prepare tea service and appropriate accompaniments." And Camille said, "Of course," and Marcus hesitated before saying, "He also wanted to remind you of the confidentiality parameters." And she said, "Understood. I'm simply the chef with the athletic training dietary story." And Marcus's professional composure softened almost imperceptibly as he said, "For what it's worth, Miss May, you've accomplished more for him in 6 days than anything else has managed in 9 months. He's eating properly. He's less tightly wound. You're genuinely beneficial for him." And warmth moved through Camille's chest as she said, "Thank you, Marcus." And he said, "I thought you should know before you meet her, with something particular living in his delivery." And when Camille asked, "What is she like Vivian Marcus's?" face achieved careful neutrality as he said, "She's very accomplished in social navigation, very aware of where she positions relative to others, very invested in appearances and their management," which was the most diplomatically constructed way Camille had ever heard someone communicate a complicated truth. And the following afternoon Camille was arranging a carefully constructed tea service when she heard the front door open and a voice that arrived before its owner did, saying, "Sterling, darling, I'm here." The traffic was absolutely prehistoric, and Camille observed as a woman entered who appeared to have stepped directly out of an editorial shoot, Vivian Ashford being striking in the way that suggested considerable investment in that outcome. Tall and perfectly proportioned, with sleek auburn hair that moved like it had been choreographed, wearing a cream designer suit, and carrying a bag whose price point Camille had once looked up out of sheer curiosity, and she was surveying the penthouse with the proprietary assessment of someone taking inventory. And Sterling appeared from his study, and Vivian immediately attached herself to his arm, saying, "Darling, I've been absolutely depleted without you. You've been so completely unavailable lately. You're not deliberately avoiding me, are you?" in a voice carrying an affected quality that made Camille's back teeth ache, and Sterling said, "I've been focused on work, Vivian." And she said, "Too focused for your girlfriend. We haven't had a proper evening together in nearly 3 weeks." And he said, "I told you my training and dietary protocols are requiring my full," before Vivian's expression brightened with sudden interest, saying, "Oh, speaking of which, where is this mysterious new chef I've been hearing whispers about?" And Camille stepped into the dining room with her most genuinely professional expression, saying, "That would be me, Camille May." And Vivian's gaze moved across Camille from head to foot with the efficiency of someone conducting an assessment, taking in the jeans and the cart t-shirt and the braids, and the judgment arrived and completed itself in approximately 1.5 seconds before Vivian said with a smile that existed purely in the technical sense, "Oh, you're darling and quite young." And Camille said pleasantly 25, and Vivian laughed a sound like expensive wind chimes in cold weather, saying, practically still discovering things, "Sterling, she's absolutely precious. Where did you find her?" And Sterling said, his expression carefully neutral, "Miss May came with exceptional recommendations. Her mother established one of the most respected food operations in East Baltimore." And Vivian repeated, "East Baltimore," with the precise inflection of someone filing information in the wrong category, before saying, "How genuinely authentic." And Camille said smoothly, "I've prepared afternoon tea. Please make yourself comfortable." And as Vivian settled into a chair, she immediately began rearranging Camille's thoughtfully assembled presentation with the casual authority of someone in their own space, saying, "These are very homestyle," which she clearly intended as something other than a compliment, before adding, "Sterling, darling, are you certain this is the caliber appropriate for someone of your standing? You should have a chef with proper institutional credentials, not someone who learned her craft from a food cart." And Camille felt her jaw tighten fractionally before Sterling said, "Camille's cooking is precisely what I need. I wouldn't alter a single element." And his eyes briefly connected with Camille's, with something carrying almost imperceptible amusement, and something quietly warm moved through Camille's chest, while Vivian's perfectly maintained composure tightened almost invisibly as she said, "Of course, darling, I'm simply advocating for you," before turning to Camille with a smile that didn't reach the specific area where sincerity lies, saying, "You'll have to share the recipe for these little sandwiches. I'm certain my chef would enjoy attempting them." And Camille said pleasantly, "They're quite straightforward. They simply require quality ingredients and genuine investment in the outcome." And Sterling produced a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh, while Vivian's smile became more structural and less functional as she said, "I'm certain you do your absolute best with your particular background." And over the subsequent 30 minutes, Camille completed her comprehensive understanding of Vivian Ashford as she referenced exclusive establishments with the frequency of someone taking inventory, and steered every conversation towards Sterling's professional accomplishments in ways that reflected favorably on herself, and monitored her phone with the regularity of someone expecting critically important news that perpetually failed to arrive, and discussed Sterling's business prospects with an interest that had a specific texture to it, and deployed small observations clearly designed to establish hierarchy, saying things like, "Sterling, you absolutely must bring your chef to the charity gala. I'm certain she's never experienced anything like the venue. It would be a genuine education for her." And, "Camille, do you find shopping at the more accessible retailers? I think their selections are quite good for everyday needs." And, "It must be charming working with simple, familiar ingredients. Sterling's restaurants use preparations that are quite sophisticated. You've probably encountered them only in reading." While Camille maintained her professional demeanor and said nothing in direct response, though Sterling was visibly becoming less comfortable with each exchange, and eventually Vivian stood and said with an edge beneath the sweetness, "You'll collect me at 7 on Saturday, the gallery opening." And Sterling's expression shifted as he said, "Saturday. Vivian, I told you I can't manage public dining events during my current," before she interrupted, "Your current training protocols have been your explanation for absolutely everything recently. No dinners, no events, no meaningful time. I'm beginning to wonder if there's an alternative explanation for why you won't be seen with me publicly." And it wasn't a request, but a structured ultimatum, and Sterling's eyes went very still before he said, "Fine, 7 o'clock." And Vivian's smile returned triumphant and immediately warm as she kissed his cheek, leaving a visible mark, and said, "That's my Sterling," before glancing at Camille and saying, "Make certain he eats well before Saturday. I need him at his best." Like she was preparing him for a presentation, and he was something she managed. And after Vivian departed, the penthouse became noticeably more inhabitable, and Sterling removed the lipstick from his cheek with barely contained patience and apologized to Camille, who said, "It's not something you need to apologize for." And he said, "She wasn't accurate in how she spoke to you or about you." And she said, "She's your girlfriend. She's protective of that. I understand the impulse." And he said directly, "Camille, just say what you're actually thinking." And she said carefully, "I'm thinking that you're an adult who can make his own choices about relationships, and I'm the chef. But if I were involved with someone who addressed my staff the way she addressed me and discussed me the way she discusses you, like you're an extension of her public image rather than a person, I'd be asking myself some specific questions." And Sterling studied her face, saying, "You don't moderate yourself much, do you?" And she said, "You're paying me to cook, well, not to tell comfortable inaccuracies." And those dimples appeared as he said, "Fair enough." And she started to leave, then paused, saying, "Sterling, for whatever it's worth, you deserve someone who loves you for who you actually are, not for what you represent for them." And left before he could respond, though she felt his attention following her all the way to the elevator. And over the following week, Vivian began appearing at the penthouse without advance notice, always during Camille's cooking hours, always with some pretext about being in the vicinity, always watching Camille with the focused attention of someone monitoring a potential threat, saying things like, "Oh, you're still here," and suggesting that Sterling should really consider more elevated options for his chef situation, claiming she knew several graduates of serious culinary programs who would be genuinely exceptional for the role, and Camille maintained warmth and professionalism throughout, while Sterling grew visibly more uncomfortable with each visit. And one afternoon, Vivian's careful composure cracked completely during an argument that Camille couldn't entirely avoid hearing through the penthouse walls. Vivian saying, "Do you know how it appears when my boyfriend won't attend public functions with me?" And Sterling saying, "Vivian, my dietary requirements." And she saying, "Are becoming an embarrassment, Sterling. People are beginning to make observations." And the argument continued with Camille focusing with determined concentration on her cooking until Sterling appeared in the kitchen doorway afterward and said, "Camille," and she said honestly, "I heard more than I should have. I'm sorry about that." And he said, "It's not your situation to apologize for," and stepped closer saying, "She's not entirely wrong that I've been distracted." And Camille said, "You have legitimate reasons for everything you're managing." And he said, "That's not actually what I meant," and held her gaze for a moment that said considerably more than his words had before saying, "Good night, Camille." And she left quickly, her thoughts conducting themselves in chaotic and distinctly unprofessional directions. And she called Priya that night, who delivered the diagnostic confidence of someone who assessed symptoms professionally, saying, "You have feelings for your billionaire employer. This is not a complicated diagnosis." And Camille said, "I'm aware of the situation," and Priya said, "Who has an existing girlfriend." And she said, "Also aware." And Priya asked, "So the treatment plan?" And Camille said, "Absolutely nothing. I cook his food, deposit my compensation, and maintain appropriate professional behavior." And Priya asked, "How's that approach working currently?" And Camille said catastrophically, and Priya said philosophically, "Trash has a historical tendency to remove itself. Just wait." And Camille didn't have to wait as long as she'd anticipated, because the breaking point arrived on a Friday when Sterling was scheduled to accompany Vivian to the gallery opening, and Camille had prepared several make-ahead meals and was nearly ready to leave when Vivian appeared 2.5 hours early without Sterling, and Camille said confused, "He's not here. I thought you were meeting at 7. And Vivian stepped past Camille into the penthouse saying, "I need to speak with you directly, woman to woman," and turned to face her, arms precisely crossed, saying, "I'd like you to resign, leave, pursue other opportunities. I'll even facilitate the process. I have relationships throughout the industry. But I want you away from Sterling." And Camille asked, "Does Sterling know you're here having this conversation?" And Vivian said, Sterling doesn't always have clarity about what he requires. I do, and her composed surface cracked slightly as she said, I see how you look at him, and how he looks at you. We've been together for 2 years. 2 years of genuine relationship, and then you arrive with your braids and your comfort food, and suddenly, he's different, lighter, more present in a way he hasn't been with me in months. And Camille felt a complicated flash of something, containing both sympathy and frustration, as she said, perhaps that's a conversation worth having with him directly. And Vivian said, I'm having it with you, and if I decline, before her expression moved from appeal to something colder, as she said, then I'll make your professional life considerably more difficult. I have relationships with everyone who matters in this city's food and hospitality industry. I can ensure your cart struggles. I can ensure your name becomes associated with things you'd prefer it wasn't. I have both the motivation and the resources. And then Sterling's voice arrived from the doorway saying, then you should have nothing to concern yourself with. And both women turned to find Sterling standing there, his expression carrying the specific quality of someone who has heard enough to form a complete picture. And Vivian said, darling. But Sterling said, I heard the nature of this conversation, Vivian. You came to my home without informing me to threaten someone I employ and value. And she said, I was simply having a candid discussion. But he said, this is finished. What we've had is finished. It's been finished for some time, and I've been avoiding acknowledging that clearly. And Vivian's face moved through several things quickly as she said, you're ending this for her. Some woman you've known for not quite 2 weeks. And Sterling said, I'm ending this because you just showed me something I needed to see clearly, and because I've been dishonest with myself about this relationship for too long. And Vivian said, her voice climbing, this is completely irrational. You've been behaving strangely for months, distant, secretive, hiding things from me, and now you're choosing to protect her. And Sterling said simply, Vivian, in a tone that was final. And Vivian looked between them, her expression cycling through anger and wounded pride and something underneath that might have been genuine hurt, before saying, you're both going to regret this significantly. And Sterling said, the only thing I regret is not being honest sooner about the direction this was heading. And Vivian collected herself with visible effort and left the door closing with controlled force behind her. And silence occupied the penthouse until Camille said, her breathing unsteady, Sterling, that was 2 years. And he said, yes. And she said, I can't be the reason. And he said, you're not the reason. Her behavior tonight is the reason. The past 6 months of this relationship are the reason. And crossed the room toward her saying, you were simply the clarity. And she said, that's not, Sterling, I work for you, this is. And he said, Camille, I'm not asking you anything. I'm just telling you something true. For the first time in 9 months, I feel like myself. Not because the condition is resolved, but because of who I am when I'm around you. Because you see me, not Sterling cross the Enterprise, just me. And Camille felt tears forming in a way she hadn't anticipated as she said, I need to think. This is too much at once, I need. And Sterling stepped back, giving her room, saying, of course, take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere. And Camille gathered her things with hands that weren't entirely steady and left. And the following 2 weeks were genuinely difficult, as she threw herself back into the food cart with the intensity of someone trying to outwork their feelings, and business was initially strong, with curiosity bringing customers, but then strange things began happening. Complaints about the food and customers claiming to find foreign materials, and on day 11 a woman at the cart created a scene about discovering a roach in her bowl, and Camille's blood went cold saying, that's not possible. I maintain this equipment meticulously every single day. And the health department arrived within hours and found 3 additional roaches, all deceased and positioned in locations suggesting deliberate arrangement rather than natural infestation, and the cart was closed pending investigation. And Camille stood on her sidewalk watching inspectors seal her mother's life's work with official tape and felt something break quietly inside her as she told Priya that evening, her voice unsteady. "This makes no sense. I clean everything daily. I have never had any contamination issue." And Priya said, "Someone placed them deliberately." And Camille stopped and thought about Vivian's final look, and Vivian's specific parting comment, and Vivian's stated resources and stated motivation. And her phone rang from an unknown number, and something made her answer, and Vivian's voice arrived like something cold and smooth, saying, "Camille, May, how's business this week?" And Camille's grip tightened on the phone as she said, "What exactly did you do?" And Vivian said, "I simply mentioned to some individuals with relevant interests that I'd heard concerning things about sanitation standards at a particular cart. Those individuals apparently took it upon themselves to investigate." And Camille said, "You placed those roaches," and Vivian said, "Can you establish that with evidence? Because from where I'm positioned, your cart was shut down for legitimate health violations. That's a business management problem." And Camille said, "That is criminal sabotage, and you know it precisely." And Vivian said, "What I know is that I told you what would happen if you didn't maintain appropriate distance from Sterling. You didn't listen. And now we're here, and Sterling called me last week incidentally, said he'd been hasty, that he missed what we had together. We're reconciling." And the words landed like something physical as Camille stood very still saying, "I don't believe you." And Vivian said, "You don't have to, but if you care at all about his stability, you'll maintain your distance. Or next time it won't be simply the cart," before ending the call. And Camille sat in her apartment for a long time, shaking with something that contained equal parts rage and grief, before calling Dorothea, who was still in evening rehabilitation. And Camille went to her mother's apartment and sat on the familiar couch and told her everything, and by the end was crying in a way that was difficult to do gracefully, saying, "I made a mess of everything, Mama." And Dorothea pulled her close with her stronger arm, saying, "You didn't create this mess. That woman created this mess because she recognized something real was happening, and she decided to destroy it rather than accept it," and cupped Camille's face, saying, "You are a Dorothea, May's daughter. We don't surrender to people like her." And then Camille's phone rang from an unknown number, and Dorothea nodded gently, and Camille answered to hear, "Miss May, this is Commissioner Holloway from the Baltimore Food Safety Office. Regarding the investigation of your cart, we've completed preliminary findings, and there are significant irregularities in this case. The specimens found were all the same species, all recently deceased, within a narrow time window of 48 to 60 hours. We found no evidence of any actual infestation, no biological evidence of any kind suggesting a resident population. The specimens appear to have been placed deliberately. Your inspection history is completely clean across 4 years of operation, and we don't believe this reflects any genuine health concern on your part. Your cart will be cleared for reopening after a final inspection, and we're pursuing who filed the initial complaints, as false reporting to public health authorities carries significant consequences." And Camille said, "I might have relevant information. I would need help establishing it properly." And after ending the call, felt something settle and solidify inside her, because Vivian had genuinely miscalculated who she was dealing with. So Camille pulled up the number Vivian had used and called it directly, and Vivian answered with an expectation of superiority, and Camille said, her voice calm and clear, "I'm calling to tell you something specific. I was attempting to be professional and respectful, and I stepped away because I didn't want to be responsible for disrupting something that existed. But you've shown me exactly what you are, and I'm done making accommodations for it." And Vivian started to speak, but Camille continued, "The health department is very interested in who filed those complaints and who had the means to acquire and place those specimens. I've already spoken with them. I'm documenting everything now, including this conversation. So here is what happens next. You leave my business alone. You leave my mother's legacy alone. and you allow Sterling to make his own decisions about his own life, because that's how this works between actual adults. And after a silence, Vivian said, "You recorded this." And Camille said, "Everything since you called. The health department will find it very useful." And Vivian's breath changed as she said, "You're overestimating your position significantly." And Camille said, "And you underestimated mine from the beginning. That's a pattern with you. May the better woman simply be herself. We'll see what happens," and ended the call with her hands trembling, but her resolve the most solid thing she'd felt in weeks. And Dorothea was watching her with an expression of pure maternal pride, saying, "That's exactly who I raised you to be." And then Camille's phone rang again, and it was Sterling, and her heart relocated itself to her throat as she answered and heard his voice rough with sleep deprivation saying, "Camille, we need to talk." And she said, "Sterling, I don't think." And he said, "I haven't eaten properly in 2 weeks. I can't think clearly, I can't function. And before you attribute that entirely to the condition, I need you to know it isn't. It stopped being only about the food after the first week." And her breath held itself as she said carefully, "Vivian told me she was reconciling with you, that you'd called her." And Sterling said, "I called her to tell her to stop whatever she was doing to you, and your business." That was the complete content of that conversation. "There is no reconciliation, there never will be." And then said very carefully, very quietly, "The only person I want to speak with is currently on the other end of this call. And Camille, I need to ask you something honest. Is there any possibility you'll let me try to make this right?" And Camille's eyes filled as she said, "Sterling, I'm a complete mess right now. The cart situation, my finances, everything." And he said, "Then let me be there for that. Let me help. Come back, please." And she asked quietly, "Why? Why does this matter so much to you?" And after a long silence, Sterling said, "Because somewhere between the first bowl you handed me and the last meal you prepared before you left, I fell completely in love with you. I know the timing is terrible, and I know everything about this is complicated, but it's the truest thing I know right now." And Camille pressed her hand over her mouth as tears ran freely down her face and said, "You love me." And Sterling said, "Your stubbornness and your passion, and the way you cook like it's the most important thing you'll do that day. The way you stood your ground with Vivian when you had every reason to simply accept her terms. The way you make me feel like a person rather than a professional category." And Camille looked at her mother, who had tears in her own eyes and was nodding with complete certainty, and said, "I fell for you too. I tried not to. I reminded myself daily of every professional and personal reason not to, but I fell completely." And Sterling exhaled like he'd been holding that breath for weeks, saying, "Tell me where you are." And 30 minutes later there was a knock at Dorothea's door, and Camille opened it to find Sterling Cross in jeans and a simple jacket, looking like someone who'd been somewhere difficult and just found his way back, unshaven, and with eyes carrying the particular quality of too little sleep and too much thinking, and he'd never looked more real. And they stayed looking at each other for a moment before Sterling stepped forward and cupped her face with both hands and kissed her like he'd been waiting for exactly this for considerably longer than 2 weeks. And when they separated, both slightly unsteady, Sterling pressed his forehead to hers, saying, "I want to do this properly, all of it, help you with your mother's bills, help you rebuild the cart, rebuild everything Vivian tried to damage, and I want to do it as someone who's honest about how much you matter to me." And Camille laughed, and it came out slightly tearful as she said, "You're a lot, Sterling Cross." And he said, "I've been told. Is that a yes?" And she said, "Yes, that's a yes," before Dorothea's voice arrived from the living room saying, "Is someone going to introduce this man to me properly? Or are you planning to stand in the doorway indefinitely? I have questions, and I'm not getting any younger." And Sterling looked toward her voice with the expression of someone who understood the importance of the next 5 minutes and said nervously, "Your mother." And Camille smiled, saying, "The one and only." And he said, I want to make a good impression." And she said, "You run a multi-restaurant enterprise across 3 cities, and meeting my mama makes you nervous?" And he said, "Your mama is important to you. That makes her important to me." And Camille took his hand and led him into the living room, where Dorothea sat regarding Sterling Cross with the complete assessment of a woman who had seen considerable amounts of life and could identify character fairly quickly. And Dorothea said, "So you're the man who's had my daughter walking around her own home looking like she lost something?" And Sterling took her hand with both of his, saying, "Yes, ma'am, and I intend to spend significant time making up for the inconvenience that caused." And Dorothea studied him, saying, "My daughter is the finest person I know. If you do anything to suggest she's anything less than that, I will find ways to make my displeasure known regardless of any professional standing you hold." And Sterling said seriously, "I would expect nothing less, and I would deserve it." And Dorothea held his gaze for another moment before something in her expression settled into approval as she said, "Good answer. Now sit down and tell me exactly how you plan to help my daughter get her cart back in operation, because we have some logistics to address." And 3 months later, Camille May stood in the kitchen of May and Cross, the restaurant she and Sterling had built together, combining Dorothea's recipes, reimagined through Sterling's understanding of fine dining construction, and Camille's instinctive understanding of what made food feel like home, a restaurant that had exceeded every projection with a James Beard nomination in its 4th month and a 6-month reservation wait, and reviews that used words like transcendent and essential, and it felt like somewhere she belonged. And when her sous chef appeared saying, "Chef May, your noon reservation is here," Camille smiled, still adjusting to that title, still loving it every time, and walked to the dining room to find Sterling at their regular table, looking like what he was, someone who'd found his way back to himself. And she greeted him with professional formality, though her eyes said something considerably less professional, and he stood and drew her into an embrace despite the watching staff saying, "I was thinking we should mark an occasion." And she asked, "What occasion?" And his hand moved to rest gently against her still flat stomach as his expression contained everything. And she said, "How? The test was this morning." And Sterling said Marcus saw the box, with an expression that was part apology and part complete lack of it. And Camille said, "That man," laughing as Sterling lifted her off the ground, spinning her once while the kitchen staff began applauding from the doorway. And he said, "We're having a baby." And she confirmed, "We're having a baby." And he kissed her, and she kissed him back. And somewhere in the kitchen, Camille could hear her sous chef telling someone to please mind their station. And that evening they visited Dorothea together, who cried, then immediately began planning with the focused energy of someone who had decided that grandmothering was her next area of dedicated expertise. And later in the penthouse that had become their shared home, Sterling lay with his arms around Camille while the harbor lights moved on the water outside their window, and asked, "Are you thinking?" And she said, "About everything. About how a car breaking down in front of a food cart changed the entire trajectory of my life." And he said, "Best mechanical failure I ever experienced." And she said, "Sterling." And he said, And she said, "Thank you for stepping out of that car that day, even annoyed as you were." And Sterling's laugh moved through his chest as he said, "Thank you for refusing to let me ignore you." And she said, "I was very persistent." And he said magnificently, "So." And they stayed quiet for a comfortable while, and Camille thought about the distance between who she'd been, a frightened young woman trying to hold together her mother's legacy against impossible odds, and who she was becoming, and she thought about what she'd learned through all of it, which was this: love doesn't arrive when you've arranged everything properly. It doesn't wait until your circumstances are orderly, or your confidence is steady, or your life resembles something you planned. Sometimes love arrives when you're fighting just to maintain what matters. When you're desperate enough to approach a stranger's broken-down car on a Wednesday with nothing but a worn apron and your grandmother's recipes and the stubborn conviction that what you make has value. And when it arrives, the kind that looks at your reality honestly and says, yes, exactly this I want this. You don't overthink it. You don't let pride or other people's opinions or your own fear of how impossible it seems get in the way. You hold on and you let it change you, and you let it be enough because it is.